Good afternoon, class. Hope you guys are doing well, guys and gals. The level of discussion has just been fantastic. I want to really commend each of you for your contributions to that. It requires a good rapport between students and professor, I think, to be able to create the kind of environment that you folks have created, a context that lets you raise questions that challenge each other, but in ways that are respectful and that further our dialogue, gives us all something to think about that we wouldn't otherwise have thought about. So give yourselves a pat on the back for that. It's been a very, very good first quarter or so of the semester. You folks are a very talkative bunch, which on the one hand is really good, because what it means is that your engagement with each other is such high quality, it makes you a pretty easy class to teach. On the other hand, it's a challenge for me to try to keep up with all that you've written, so I try to do that. I comment as frequently as I can, but of course there are cases where there's enough repetition that I can do my responses selectively, but there just wouldn't be enough time in the day if I responded to every one of you individually. So it's kind of like I said, it's both opportunity and challenge at the same time. We will continue on the themes that we've discussed in the first 3 weeks throughout the rest of the semester, because the understanding of what it is that constitutes public theology, it's hard to have a conversation about public theology without knowing what it is. And so getting those boundaries laid out as we have, and attempt to understand what we mean when we use the phrase public theology, that set of skills and those set of definitions will be things that we'll use for the rest of the semester. Today we're moving on to Wolf's book, Public Faith. It will still fall into the category of definitional, if you will. The first part of our semester here is on laying the theological historical foundations for trying to make sense of what we're going to be talking about further on. We will continue to read it seems to me to be a not terribly aggressive pace. But given the material is new, it's aggressive enough. On the introduction for Wolf's book, I have relatively little. In fact, I don't think I'm going to say much of anything about it specifically. What I am most interested in is hearing your thoughts on his last section, Toward an Alternative. And then, this Kindle is crazy. Sometimes it puts numbers at the bottom, and sometimes location. I'm not really sure why. But there's a section called Toward an Alternative in the introduction. And then there's a section of, I think it's 6 numbered points. The center of the Christian faith suggests a relation to the broader culture that can roughly be described in the following 6 points. I want to hear your critique and affirmations of what he has to say there. I think all of what we're trying to do here so far, not all of what we're trying to do, wrapped up in the definitional work, is an attempt to make sure that we see the importance that public theology has to our job as followers of Jesus. It's very easy for us to become very focused inwardly and make the Christian faith all about a relationship between me and Jesus, and to fail to see the communal implications of that in their fullness. I mean, we all know that there are some communal implications, but to see their communal/global implications is something that is often overlooked. In a book by Ron Sider called Churches That Are Making a Difference, he celebrated what he believed was an end to that period of time where the two different parts of Protestantism kind of moved in different directions. We had one group, often I think evangelicals would most evangelicals would be put into this category. There were those who focused on the importance of personal salvation. There was resistance to the idea that we're supposed to do things and works that we're supposed to engage in. That was largely seen to be a waste of time to the primary task of converting souls. On the other hand, you had what's often characterized as mainliners, and we UMers, we sort of straddle that distinction. Some of us fall into either camp. But the mainliners tended to think of things as, we got people who are suffering. Jesus went around ministering to people. We need to be about that. And so the focus was on justice, social justice sorts of issues. Now, what Ron was celebrating is that he thinks that we're at a point in history where the social justites and the evangelites both are beginning to see and increasingly seeing the importance of what the other side is saying. And we're beginning to see what he characterizes as holistic ministry. Ministry where we both care for the person's soul and for their well-being in this world. It's a holistic in the sense that it cares for the whole person. It's holistic in that it more holistically mimics the ministry that we see of Jesus and related throughout, particularly the New Testament. So that then raises the question, if you're going to get serious about that, it raises the question of how one engages with the culture. And there have been popular views. Reinhold Niebuhr characterized several of those a number of years ago in his writings. And then, of course, we got here in Wolf's book an alternative approach to that. On your, what was it, recommended reading list, I'm not a silly guy who thinks that you have time to read books that are on the recommended list, but I have a book on the recommended list that, or one of mine is on the recommended list, called Christians into Common Good. And it came out just about the same time as Wolf's. They were very close together in time. Where his is more, I would say, meta-practical, and I don't mean impractical, I mean practical in the sense of practice-oriented. So it's sort of at the next level up, where I think mine is trying to get into proposals about what it actually looks like to live out the faith and every day in the world with the people that we encounter. And I admit up front that I have a particular angle that I come at these questions. But what I do, whereas in what we see here, we have this sort of high-level argument about the ways in which Christians and religious people in general, to some extent, can interact with culture, whereas what I've done is sort of taken a different angle on it, which is to say, if we're going to know how it is that God wants us to live with the people around us, we probably ought to look in Scripture and see what kinds of things God has to say about what the life that pleases Him looks like. So I have a theological section that deals with what do we learn from the Incarnation, what do we learn from the Trinitarian nature of God, and so on. And then a biblical section that talks about, I think there's 20 or so vignettes from Old Testament through to the New, where I try to discern what the life that pleases God looks like. How does God intend us to live together? And then in the last section, I make some arguments about what sorts of particular policies and practices in the U.S., what sort of public institutions might actually enable that way of living together. Wolf, as I said, comes at it from a different angle. I think they're both important. I would characterize mine as more specific about what it is we're supposed to learn from Scripture and how we're supposed to live that out. And I think his is more abstract in the sense that it, as I said, is kind of at the next level up. Now, I just say that to give you a comparison between the two and give you a sense of what's going on. I could do some more on my particular book, but I think, given our global focus of what we're trying to do and a development focus of what we're trying to do, I probably would prefer not to do that and to stay on the book by Wolf. And then I'm going to begin next week trying to fold in some of these other issues and how they relate to what we've been talking about. We are sort of at the historical, theoretical level now, but we very quickly got to get to the pragmatic level where we're going to be working for the rest of the semester. Give me just a second here. I'm going to lean forward. I saw a little light blink on the recorder. I want to make sure it doesn't mean that the battery's about to run down or anything. Nope, I think we're good. Okay, so I thought it was very interesting, his first chapter, the chapter after the introduction, he calls malfunctions of faith. And what he does here is he describes ways in which the problems that we encounter with religious folks in the culture at large have to do with ways in which our religion is functioning improperly. It isn't that it's religion per se that's the problem, but it's the way in which it's being deployed. So, for example, on page 5, now we're back to page numbers. On page 5, toward the end of that page, before the section that starts prophetic religions, for this, in the end, is what the Christian faith as a prophetic religion is all about, being an instrument of God for the sake of human flourishing in this life and the next. that to me sort of captures the global range, if you will, of what we try to worry about in public theology. Then when he gets over here and he starts to talk about malfunctions, like I said, I thought that was particularly helpful. On page 7, he makes the following comment. The Christian faith malfunctions when it is practiced as a mystical religion in which assent is followed by a barren rather than a creative return, a return that has no positive purpose for the world, but is merely an inevitable result of the inability of a flesh and blood human being to sustain unitive experience over time. In other words, one of the ways in which Christian faith malfunctions is that it's become so inwardly focused, that it doesn't have the corresponding effects that it should outwardly. It doesn't take what it's learning from God and in a creative and prophetic way put that to practice in the world. Creative in the sense that it looks for new solutions. Prophetic in the sense that it calls us to be responsive to God. Now, of course, he recognizes that the flip of that is a problem as well. We can become so externally focused that we lose track of who it is is supposed to be motivating and how it is that the love of Christ is supposed to be at the center of what we're doing. He says that, as much as says that on the page 9 when he says leave either one out, that is the assent or the inner focus, he calls it assent, the rising up to be united with God, or the creative return, the part where we come back and start to live out life. And then down a few more lines, for a religion to maintain its prophetic character, ordinary believers and their leaders must replicate in their own way both the ascent and return of the great founding figures. How is it in our lives that we're going to both ascend in our inner lives, in our inner relationship with God, but then have that bring us back into the world to be in a more powerful way than ever before? Now he talks about functional reduction on page 9. No assent has happened, instead a pretense of assent and of speaking and acting in the name of God is employed to promote preset desirable ends. Now that's an interesting and challenging thing for us to ponder. How is it that we malfunction on this reduction side that he's talking about? Well, it's when we don't really have that inner connection with God. It's when we don't really have the assent where we're united with God. Instead, the assent is no more than a pretense. We use God language, but that motivation and centering just isn't there. And then the next one, the flip side of that, he mentions on page 10, he calls it idolatric substitution, needing to engage the world in God's name and yet finding it difficult, uncomfortable, or even contrary to their deep-seated convictions to properly identify God and discern God's will. Prophets sometimes transform God in their imagination into a caricature of true divinity. Now, I have to say, the way in which that comes to mind most for me is, well, I think prosperity gospel might be one way to think about that. Because rather than allowing our theological imaginations to be formed by the God who empties himself to become human, who takes on the role of servant to all, who gives his life as a ransom for many, that's uncomfortable, challenging, and it doesn't exactly contribute to us having a big house, a nice car, and a comfortable life, right? And so it's very easy then to trade that view for a different view that we prefer. And I think this happens a lot in us. In fact, I sometimes wonder if it isn't this besetting sin of the 21st century that we don't really like the call to sacrifice and self-giving that's contained in the gospel. And so instead we reconstruct Christian faith around our own idols, to use his language. Now he talks about some ways in which the return fails because of idleness. That is, we don't exactly live out what we're called to. It's too easy to just become settled. The challenges become too hard. Notice on page 13 More than a century ago, Max Weber ended his classic, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, by speaking of the modern market as an iron cage. What he had in mind is roughly something like this. If you play the game, you have to play it by preset rules, which in the case of the market means that you must maximize profit. These rules and not moral considerations determine how the game is played. Now let me just give you an example of that. A friend, Brian McLaren and Stephen Chalk and I taught a class together at Asbury. It's been probably 6 years ago or so now. It was a J-term course in January, the January J-term. And Steve was telling this story. He's from London, England, and he ran into one of his friends who I think was a banker. And what he was saying to Stephen was, man, you can't share this with anybody, but I'm kind of distraught about it. You know, tomorrow we're going to merge with this other bank, and it's just going to have enormous implications. And Steve said, yeah, that really does sound like a big deal. How's that going to affect your employees? And he responded, well, there's 1,100 redundancy slips that have already been prepared. Redundancy slips, layoff slips, we would call them here. What he was saying is that this merger was going to effectively do away with 1,100 jobs. And Stephen said, man, that's just remarkable. Have you thought about the implications that's going to have for those 1,100 families? And he said, oh, I know it's just going to be devastating. And Stephen said, well, if it's devastating and it sounds like you don't really much like it, why are you doing it? And he says, oh, well, we have to do it. And Stephen said, well, why is it that you have to do it? And he said, well, because those are the way the economic rules are. And he said, well, tell me what you mean by that. And he said, well, the bottom line is this. There's a profit opportunity with regard to purchasing this other bank. If we don't do it, somebody else will. If somebody else does it, then it's going to put pressure on us, and eventually we could go out of business. So it's just the way the system works, is basically what he was saying. And as I mentioned, I think, to you in one of my posts the other day, using a different example, but this is an example of systemic sin, and it's an example of what Wolf has in mind here. We create systems that help us to manage the world. We create them with regard to internal public institutions in the U.S., but we also have these systems at a global level that determine how we interact with each other, how we lend and borrow money, and so on. And just as he said here, to play the game, we've built the system so that you have to play by those rules, even if those rules aren't necessarily particularly well aligned with human flourishing. I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves as Christians is, given the level of suffering at a global level, what changes in our systems need to occur for us to genuinely live out the desire to see all humans flourish? Okay, moving on. It's interesting what he says on page 14, especially I don't think he's using sphere the same way as we did last week by Kuyper, but it's interesting how he says this. The modern world, differentiated as it is into multiple and relatively autonomous spheres, is a world of many gods. Each sphere, be it be it politics, law, business, media, or whatever, imposes its own rules upon those who wish to participate in it. In this new polytheism, we follow the voice of one God at work, another at home, and maybe yet another at church. The rules that exist in each of the spheres have control over us and guide us into how that we're supposed to behave. The question is, from a Christian perspective, do those rules, do those spheres function in ways that are pleasing to God? Then going on to the next page, actually, I mean, this is really rich, this section here, so I'm going to draw your attention to several things. It's the critique of Marx on Hegel. You've probably heard this phrase that he called Christian faith the opiate of the masses. But notice what he goes on to say here. The young Karl Marx famously noted that religion, the Christian faith he meant primarily, is the opiate of the people. It's a drug and it's a downer or depressant, insulating people from the pain of oppressive social realities and consoling them with the dream world of heavenly bliss. Alternatively, religion can function as an upper, a stimulant, energizing people for the task at hand. a function Marx failed to grasp. And I think he's absolutely right about that. Marx did fail to grasp that. But it is the case that we need to recognize both of what's going on here. On the one hand, religion can be a powerful energizer, and that energizer can be for good or for ill. As we saw in his references to cases where extreme faith leads us to be act in extreme ways and actually to harm rather than to help each other. But at the same time, it can be positive. I mean, it's that energizing of E. Stanley Jones, who goes off to do great evangelistic work on the continent of India. I mean, it's continent of Asia, the country of India. It's can be both positive and negative. But when Marx said that religion was the opiate of the people, here's what he meant. He meant that many times the way religion functions is to numb the pain of the present world for the losers in the world, so that the winners then don't have to be bothered by worrying about them, and it instead pushes our hope off into the next life, a way of dulling a sense that this particular world is unjust. Booty and Brimlow, in a book called Christianity Incorporated, made a very similar claim when they said that in the U.S. religion had been reduced, Christian faith, they were specific, one religion in general, Christian faith had been reduced to the role of chaplain to capitalism. Now what he meant by that is the following. What is it that a chaplain does? A chaplain binds up and heals the wounds that are a part of playing in the game. In other words, if you're a chaplain in the military, part of your role is to minister to people as they're on the battlefield, to soothe them in moments of loss, and then to comfort families who've lost persons as well. What is it you're not allowed to do? What you're not allowed to do is question the underlying rules of the game. You're not allowed to say you should be a pacifist. And so what Marx is suggesting is a similar sort of thing. The way that religion functions many times, and we should recognize that he's right often, not all the time by any stretch of the imagination, but this isn't a criticism that we could just sweep off blithely either. Too many times we allow religion to function as a drug that numbs us to injustice. We need more often to let it be the thing that energizes us to engage with injustice and to help resolve it. I like how he said on the next page, page 16, faith does its proper work when 1, it sets us on the journey, launches us out. 2, guides us along the way, gives us the images of what life is supposed to look like, and then gives us meaning as we move along. It was interesting, I thought, again on 17, it's after footnote 33, most frequently the adherents of prophetic religion will let faith dictate the ends to be achieved, say protecting unborn life or abolishing the death penalty, but fail to allow faith to determine the means to achieve those ends. Opponents are not even respected, let alone treated with benevolence and beneficence. Perhaps one way to think about that is to say we're willing to look for some of the kinds of outcomes that we believe Scripture calls us to, but the means, that is, taking up our cross and bearing it daily, is not the way that we would like to do it. We'd rather find our own way to do it that has a good deal less pain associated with it. Moving on to the next chapter, he begins to dig more deeply into this whole issue of idleness. He just a few lines down into the paragraph. The first concerns the character believers. For some people, the faith they embrace demands too much, so they pick and choose, as in cafeteria, filling up their trays with sweets, but leaving aside the broccoli and the fish. We love to read those passages that tell us how God loves us and is going to take care of us. We don't so much like to read those passages that remind us that to be imitators of Jesus is to imitate him in his cross as well. I thought, I'm going to move a little bit faster now through the rest of this, on over to page 30. I thought this was just a brilliant quote after the second paragraph, after the section guidance. We may not be particularly attracted to being garbage collectors, but from a moral standpoint, it's a fine kind of work as well as communal necessity. Other types of work, however, are morally unacceptable. Even if I can earn a ton of money, I should never be a hired killer, or even if I deem a cause good, I may not become a terrorist to further it. But there are some types of work that may be ambiguous. Is it morally permissible to produce, market, and sell assault weapons or sex toys, to mention products that can turn two of the most powerful human urges? Is it morally permissible to work in an industry that excessively pollutes the environment? I mean, these are questions I think that ought always to be on the cusp of what we're trying to think through in terms of what it means to be followers of Jesus. But they're often things that we sort of dismiss. Just to put it to you really bluntly, I had a student say to me one time, these are as close to the actual words as I can recall them. We were talking about the impact that following Christ has on every aspect of our life, and he said something like, I really want to be a good follower of Jesus. I'm just not sure I understand why it should mess up my day-to-day life. I was sort of taken aback at that, and what to say in response was not immediately obvious. Part of me wanted to say, well, then pastoral ministry is probably not the thing you want to get into. But the idea that we can somehow count on Christ to save us, but not expect the cross to be at the center, and to not expect following God to have an impact on every aspect of our life, that just sort of surprised me. On page 38 now, moving into the section on coerciveness. Like key Enlightenment figures, many contemporaries see religion as a pernicious social ill that requires aggressive treatment, rather than considering it a medicine from which a cure can be expected. Did not the perpetrators of 9/11 terrorist attacks appeal to religion as a motivation for their violence? In the recent war in the Balkans, did not the Serbs fight for the land on which the holy sites of their religion stood? Was not difference between Catholicism and Protestantism at the heart of the civil war in Northern Ireland? Is not religion a major factor in clashes in India? The contemporary resurgence of religion seems to go hand in hand with the resurgence of religiously legitimized violence, at least in public perception. For this reason, many argue that it is necessary to weaken, neutralize, or eliminate religion outright as a factor in public life. Instead, I think what he suggests in the following is this thin and thick distinction, and he says on page 40 in particular, the cure against Christian violence is not less of the Christian faith, but in a carefully qualified sense, more of the Christian faith. Jim Wallace used to say, of course he does this from a political standpoint, don't go left, don't go right, go deeper. I mean, it's the same sort of thing here, right? It's not, don't do more of this kind of religion, don't do less of this kind of religion, just dig deeper and get into what Wolf here calls a thicker understanding of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And with that, I think those are the main points that I wanted to hit. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in the rest of this chapter, but I'd rather take up more time in us discussing it and a little less time in me going through this level of detail with you. There is one more thing I wanted to point out, and that's on page 51. In place of a conclusion, he writes, if Christian faith is not inherently violent, and if Christians who take their faith seriously are not likely to perpetrate violence, why do misconceptions about the violent character of the Christian faith abound? I have already given part of the answer. Christians have used and continue to use their faith to legitimize violence they deem necessary, and they have done so on a massive scale. Misconceptions of the Christian faith mirror the widespread behavior of Christians, and the behavior of Christians misbehavior of Christians is associated with misconstruals of their faith, with the thinning out of its thick and original elements. I think that's a very insightful comment. If we want the world to see Christianity differently, we need nothing more than to begin to live differently ourselves. Okay, so that's about the first third of Public Faith by Wolf. We'll pick up with the second third next week. As I said, I'm going to begin to supplement this with some of the other issues that we want to take as well, so that we've had a period of theology, a period where theology and practice overlap in our discussions, and a period that's more praxis focused toward the latter. Again, keep up the great conversations. I look forward to seeing what you have to say this week. Great job.